I counted the floral patterns on the back pew cushion 47 times before I realized I had become invisible, even to God. The November morning light filtered through stained glass windows, casting purple and gold shadows across empty wooden benches, while my footsteps echoed in the sanctuary like accusations. You don't belong. You don't belong. You don't belong. For 6 months now, I had been Sarah Thompson, the woman who arrived at Cornerstone Baptist Church at 6 a.m. to claim the back left pew, the one with the loose hymnal holder and the view of everyone's backs, everyone's belonging, everyone's easy laughter that never included me. Have you ever felt invisible in the place you expected to find belonging? Have you ever sat in a room full of people praising the God of love while drowning in loneliness so thick you could taste it like communion wine turned bitter? That was my Sunday morning reality. Watching Mrs. Henderson hug the Carlson family, seeing the youth group kids pile into their usual middle rows like they owned the building, observing the pastoral staff shake hands with the same circle of deacons while I sat in my assigned invisibility, counting flowers on fabric, because counting kept me from crying. My phone buzzed with weekend plans from work friends, dinner invitations from college roommates, family group chats about holiday arrangements, but not one text ever asked, "Hey Sarah, how was church?" or "Missed you at fellowship today," because you can't miss someone who was never really there. The morning my heart finally cracked open like an eggshell was the Sunday of my 34th birthday, November 15th, when I walked into that sanctuary carrying homemade lasagna for the monthly potluck, my grandmother's recipe that took 3 hours to prepare, and watched it sit untouched on the fellowship table while store-bought cookies and gas station chips disappeared within minutes. I had tried, God knows I had tried, the awkward small talk attempts that ended in polite smiles and quick escapes, the volunteering for committees that already had their inner circles established, the standing in the back during coffee fellowship hoping someone would notice my new dress or ask about my week. But I had become a ghost, haunting her own life, present but not seen, speaking but not heard, existing in the margins of a community that preached about the family of God while treating me like a distant cousin they'd rather forget. The sanctuary smelled like lemon wood polish and decades of prayers, the kind of smell that should have been comforting, but instead reminded me every Sunday of how I didn't fit into this well-established ecosystem of faith and friendship. I remember the first Sunday I walked through those heavy oak doors, 6 months and 12 days ago, wearing my best dress and carrying a hopeful heart that still believed church was where broken people went to heal together. The greeter, an elderly man with kind eyes and a firm handshake, had welcomed me with genuine warmth, asking if I was visiting family or new to the area, and I had explained that I was Sarah, recently divorced, looking for a church home, ready to start fresh in my faith journey. He had introduced me to the pastor's wife, who smiled brightly and assured me I would love it here, that Cornerstone was like a big family, and those words had settled into my chest like seeds of hope that never quite took root in the rocky soil of my guarded heart. But here's what they don't tell you about church families. They already have their children, their inside jokes, their established patterns of love and care, and sometimes there just isn't room at the table for one more. Especially not one more broken woman carrying invisible wounds and desperate questions. Week after week, I would arrive early to secure my back pew sanctuary, the place where I could observe without being observed, where I could worship without performing, where I could cry without explaining. But early arrival also meant watching the church come alive around me like a movie I wasn't cast in. The musicians would arrive first, carrying guitar cases and coffee cups, greeting each other with the easy familiarity of people who spent Friday nights in each other's homes and knew each other's children's names and birthdays. Then came the deacons, men in pressed shirts who moved with the confidence of belonging, who unlocked doors and turned on lights and checked sound systems with the proprietary care of homeowners preparing for guests. The Sunday school teachers would hurry past with boxes of supplies and arms full of lesson plans, calling out to each other about potluck assignments and committee meetings, and whose turn it was to bring donuts to the men's breakfast. And through it all, I sat in my pew like a monument to loneliness, watching the choreography of community unfold around me while I remained frozen in place, too afraid to move forward, too stubborn to leave. The children were the hardest part to watch. The way they burst through the sanctuary doors like small tornadoes of joy, racing to their parents' usual pews with the unconscious confidence of people who had never questioned whether they belonged somewhere. Little Emma Carlson always saved a seat for her best friend Maggie Wells, and they would share coloring pages and whispered secrets during the pastoral prayer, their mothers exchanging knowing smiles across the aisle while their fathers shook hands and planned fishing trips for the following weekend. The Henderson grandchildren would pile into their reserved front row like they owned stock in the church, and Mrs. Henderson would produce an endless supply of mints and tissues and small toys from her purse, the kind of grandmother magic that spoke of decades of Sunday morning rituals and established traditions. I found myself wondering what it would feel like to walk into a room and immediately know where you belonged, to have someone save you a seat, to be part of the unspoken choreography of love that played out in every glance and gesture and shared hymnal. My divorce had been final for 8 months when I first walked through those church doors, and I suppose I had been naive enough to believe that pain was a universal language that would somehow translate into instant connection with other believers. After all, hadn't Jesus called the broken and the weary? Hadn't he promised rest for heavy souls and healing for wounded hearts? But what I discovered instead was that church people, like all people, were more comfortable with healed wounds than bleeding ones, more drawn to testimonies of victory than confessions of ongoing struggle. During new member orientation, when Pastor Williams asked us to share our stories, I had been honest about my recent divorce, my season of questioning faith, my hunger for authentic community where I could bring my whole self without pretense or performance. The other new members had nodded politely, but I noticed how conversations seemed to naturally gravitate away from me during the coffee break, how prayer requests were shared for everyone except the woman whose marriage had failed and whose faith felt fragile. The loneliness was different from what I'd experienced during my marriage's slow death. That had been the loneliness of being unknown by someone who slept beside me every night, the ache of sharing a bed with a stranger who had once known my dreams and now barely knew my schedule. But this church loneliness was sharper somehow, more devastating, because it carried the weight of spiritual expectation. This was supposed to be different. This was supposed to be the place where the least and the last and the lost found family, where the God who saw Hagar in the wilderness would see me in the back pew, where love was supposed to be more than a 4-letter word thrown around in worship songs and pastoral prayers. Instead, I found myself living a strange double life, smiling during the meet and greet portion of the service while dying inside, singing about amazing grace while feeling utterly graceless, listening to sermons about God's unconditional love while feeling like the most conditional person in the room. The text messages were what finally broke something fundamental inside me. Not the absence of them, but their presence everywhere, except where I needed them most. My phone would buzz throughout the week with invitations from college friends in other cities, work colleagues planning happy hour gatherings, even my hairdresser asking if I wanted to grab coffee after my appointment. But Sunday after Sunday, as I sat in that sanctuary surrounded by people who called each other brother and sister, who spoke about their church family with tears in their eyes during testimony time, who organized meal trains for sick members and baby showers for pregnant women and going-away parties for families moving to other states, my phone remained silent. No one asked how I was adjusting to single life. No one invited me to the ladies' Bible study that met Tuesday mornings at Janet Morrison's house. No one suggested I join the young adults group that gathered for monthly game nights and seasonal service projects. The silence was so complete, so thorough, that I began to wonder if I was somehow invisible, if my pain had made me translucent, if heartbreak had turned me into a ghost that only I could see. But you know what's worse than being ignored? Being noticed just enough to know you're being ignored. The polite smiles that never reached eyes, the "how are you?" questions asked while already walking away, the conversations that paused when I approached and resumed with forced brightness that felt like verbal fluorescent lighting, harsh and artificial and designed to keep uncomfortable shadows at bay. Mrs. Patterson, the church secretary, always greeted me with the same scripted warmth she used for first-time visitors, as if she hadn't seen me every Sunday for 6 months, as if my membership paperwork hadn't been filed in her office cabinet since June. The youth pastor's wife would wave enthusiastically from across the fellowship hall, but somehow never have time to actually talk when I tried to approach, always rushing off to handle some urgent 16-year-old crisis or coordinate snacks for the next lock-in. Even the ushers, whose job it was to make everyone feel welcome, had developed a pattern of handing me bulletins with the same neutral expression they might use for telemarketers or tax collectors, professional courtesy without personal warmth. I started arriving earlier and earlier, partly to claim my preferred seat, but mostly to avoid the awkward lobby conversations where circles would form and reform around me like I was a stone in a stream, something to navigate around rather than include. By 6 a.m., the church was mine alone, and I could sit in the silence and pretend that the emptiness was by choice rather than by circumstance. The morning light would gradually fill the sanctuary, transforming it from a cavern of shadows into something almost beautiful, and I would use that quiet time to practice my church face in the dark reflection of my phone screen, the expression that said, "I'm fine," even when I was drowning, the smile that hid the questions I was too afraid to ask out loud. Why didn't anyone see me? What was wrong with me that even Christians found me ignorable? Was I too broken, too complicated, too much work for people who already had their lives figured out? The worship music was beautiful and terrible at the same time, particularly the songs about God's family and Christian unity, and the church being a place of refuge for the hurting. I would sing along, because not singing would have been obvious, but the words felt like sandpaper against my throat, rough and painful and somehow accusatory. "Blessed be your name when I'm found in the desert place," we would sing, and I wanted to raise my hand and ask, but what if the desert place is in the middle of your house? What if the wilderness is in the third pew from the back, surrounded by people who know all the words but seem to have forgotten what they mean? During one particularly difficult morning, as we sang "Come as You Are" for the third time in a month, I found myself wondering if there were invisible asterisks in the lyrics, fine print that read, "Unless you're divorced," or "Unless you're struggling," or "Unless you're the kind of person who makes others uncomfortable with your obvious need." The potluck incident was what finally convinced me that I was living in some kind of parallel universe where I existed, but didn't matter. My grandmother's lasagna recipe was legendary in my family. 4 different cheeses, homemade sauce that simmered for hours, pasta layered with the kind of care that only comes from decades of feeding people you love. I'd spent my entire Saturday preparing it, grocery shopping for the best ingredients, cooking the sauce from scratch, assembling each layer with the precision of an architect, building something meant to last. It was my offering, my attempt to contribute something meaningful to this community that seemed determined to exist without me, my way of saying, I may not fit perfectly, but I have something to give. I carried that heavy glass dish into the fellowship hall with nervous excitement, imagining someone asking for the recipe, picturing empty plates being returned with compliments and requests for seconds. Instead, I watched it sit untouched for 2 hours while people scraped the last crumbs from store-bought sheet cakes and fought over the remaining pieces of fried chicken from the grocery deli. When cleanup time came, my dish was still full, the cheese congealed and sad-looking under the harsh fluorescent lights, and I found myself scraping 3 hours of work into the garbage disposal, while Mrs. Morris thanked me for bringing something in the same tone she might use to acknowledge a participation trophy. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and wondering what kind of God allowed his children to be so cruel through kindness, so devastating through indifference, so capable of breaking hearts while singing about love. Was this what Jesus meant when he talked about his church? Was this the family he had died to create? Was this the love that was supposed to be so revolutionary it would change the world? The irony wasn't lost on me that I had never felt more alone than when I was surrounded by people who claimed to share my faith, my values, my eternal destination. In my old life, before the divorce, before the spiritual seeking, before the desperate hope that church might be different, I had been lonely but not surprised by it. The world was hard, people were selfish, community was rare. These were truths I had accepted as part of the human condition. But somehow I had expected more from the family of God, had believed the promises about perfect love, casting out fear, and believers being known by their love for one another. I had walked into that church building carrying the kind of hope that made disappointment feel like betrayal. And 6 months later, I was still carrying that hope like a wound that wouldn't heal, too stubborn to let it go, too hurt to let it flourish. My birthday fell on a Sunday that year, November 15th, and I woke up with the peculiar mixture of dread and anticipation that comes with marking another year of life during a season when you're not sure you want to keep living it. 34 years old, divorced, childless, sitting alone in my apartment drinking coffee from a mug that said, "World's Best Mom," that I had never had the heart to throw away, even though it no longer applied to my life in any meaningful way. I had planned to skip church that morning, to spend my birthday doing something that would actually bring me joy rather than remind me of everything I was missing. But some stubborn part of my soul insisted that this was exactly the kind of Sunday when God might show up, when someone might remember, when the miracle of being seen might finally happen. I chose my outfit carefully that morning, a burgundy dress that brought out the highlights in my hair and made me feel almost pretty, the kind of dress that whispered, "Notice me," without shouting it. I spent extra time on my makeup, not because I thought it would change anything, but because hope is a funny thing. It makes you do ridiculous things like believing that the right shade of lipstick might somehow make you more worthy of love. I even bought myself flowers on the way to church, a small bouquet of yellow roses that I told myself were for the sanctuary, but secretly hoped someone might notice and ask about, giving me an opening to mention that it was my birthday, that I was marking another year of life in this place that felt like death. But birthday Sundays, as it turns out, are just like regular Sundays when you're invisible. The same polite nods, the same hurried conversations that excluded you, the same prayer requests shared for everyone except the woman in the back pew who was aging into another year of loneliness. During the pastoral prayer, when Pastor Williams asked God to bless the November birthdays in the congregation, I held my breath and waited for my name to be mentioned, but apparently the church database didn't include the birth dates of ghosts. The yellow roses sat beside me on the pew like a cheerful accusation, bright and hopeful and utterly ignored, and by the time the service ended, I was stuffing them into the trash can in the ladies' bathroom, because carrying them home would have been too much like evidence of my own pathetic optimism. That was the Sunday I finally understood that hoping for human recognition in that place was like waiting for rain in the desert, theoretically possible, but practically pointless. I sat in my car in the church parking lot after everyone else had driven away, watching the building grow quiet and still in the afternoon light, and I made a decision that felt like a small death. I would stop expecting them to see me. I would stop hoping for invitations that would never come, stop scanning faces for signs of recognition that weren't there, stop carrying my heart on my sleeve like a target for indifference to aim at. If I was going to keep coming to this place, it would have to be for reasons that had nothing to do with the people who shared the space, but not the love. But God, it seemed, had other plans. During communion that first post-Hope Sunday, as I sat in my usual back pew holding grape juice that tasted like tears and a piece of bread that felt like cardboard, something shifted in the spiritual atmosphere around me. It was subtle at first, like the way air pressure changes before a storm, and I might have missed it entirely if I hadn't been so practiced at sitting still and paying attention to small things. The sanctuary was filled with the usual communion sounds, people rustling bulletins, children whispering questions about why they couldn't have crackers too, the soft clearing of throats and shifting of bodies that accompanies any moment of attempted reverence. But underneath all of that human noise, there was something else, something that felt like presence, like attention, like someone was watching me with the kind of focus that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. And then I heard it, soft as a whisper, gentle as morning light, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "I see you in the back row." My rational mind immediately pushed back, cataloging all the reasons why this was wishful thinking, emotional manipulation, the desperate imagination of a lonely woman trying to find God in her isolation. Voices in churches were usually just acoustics, wishful thinking, the product of too much hoping and not enough sleeping. But this felt different, personal, like someone calling my name in a crowded room, and despite my skepticism, despite my determination to stop expecting miraculous interventions, despite my commitment to surviving on my own terms, something inside me responded to that voice like a flower turning toward the sun. I finished communion with tears mixing into grape juice, salt, and sweetness, combining into something that tasted like acknowledgement. And for the first time in 6 months, I wasn't counting floral patterns or planning my escape route or practicing my church face. Instead, I was sitting very still and listening for that voice again, waiting to see if the God who had seemed so absent might actually have been present all along, just working in frequencies I hadn't learned to hear yet. When the service ended and I walked to my car during the closing hymn like always, something had shifted, something small but seismic, like the first crack in ice that signals spring is coming even when winter seems permanent. As I fumbled with my keys in the church parking lot, still processing what had happened during communion, a dove landed on my windshield, with the kind of confidence that suggested this was a planned encounter rather than a random bird moment. It sat there for a full minute, looking directly at me with dark, knowing eyes, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was some kind of messenger, some kind of sign, some kind of cosmic punctuation mark at the end of a very long sentence about being unseen. The dove didn't startle when I moved, didn't fly away when I started the engine, just held my gaze with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world and a message to deliver. When it finally took flight, circling my car once before disappearing into the November sky, I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel and a question burning in my chest. What if someone had been watching me count those floral patterns all along? What does it mean when even sacred spaces feel empty, when the place designed for divine encounter becomes a weekly reminder of human rejection? What happens when you discover that the God you've been looking for in other people's acceptance might have been sitting right beside you in the back pew, waiting for you to stop scanning faces and start listening for voices that speak in whispers rather than shouts? I drove home that Sunday with tears blurring my vision and a possibility lodged in my heart like a seed in rocky ground. Maybe being invisible to them didn't mean being invisible to him. Maybe being forgotten by the congregation didn't mean being forgotten by the God they claimed to serve. Maybe the emptiness I felt wasn't evidence of God's absence, but invitation to discover his presence in places I hadn't thought to look. The weeks following the dove incident passed in a strange, emotional fog, like living underwater where everything felt muffled and distorted and somehow slower than real life. I continued my Sunday morning ritual, 6 a.m. arrival, back left pew, floral pattern inventory, but something fundamental had shifted in my internal landscape, as if that whispered, "I see you in the back row," had rearranged the furniture in my soul just enough to make familiar rooms feel foreign. Have you ever experienced that peculiar numbness that follows a moment of unexpected hope, when your heart doesn't quite know how to process the possibility that everything you believed about your situation might be wrong? I found myself moving through my Sunday routine, like an actor who had forgotten her lines but kept showing up for the performance anyway, going through the motions of worship while my mind replayed that communion moment over and over, searching for evidence that it had been real rather than wishful thinking disguised as divine encounter. The emotional anesthesia was almost comforting after months of raw pain. Better to feel nothing than to feel everything. Better to question divine whispers than to hope for something that might disappoint me again. But God, it seemed, wasn't content to let me settle into comfortable numbness, because everywhere I looked in the following weeks, verses from Zephaniah kept appearing like breadcrumbs on a trail I wasn't sure I wanted to follow. The first time it happened, I was buying coffee at the little shop down the street from my apartment, the one with mismatched chairs and local art covering every available wall space, when the barista handed me my receipt, and there, printed at the bottom in small letters, were the words, "The Lord your God is with you, the mighty warrior who saves." I stared at that piece of paper for so long that the barista asked if everything was okay, and I found myself stammering something about interesting receipt messages while my heart hammered against my ribs like it was trying to escape. Coincidences like this didn't happen to people like me. I was the woman who found parking tickets, not divine messages, who discovered expired coupons, not scriptural encouragement. But there it was, black ink on white paper, undeniable and inexplicable, and somehow personally addressed to the woman who had been sitting alone in church pews for 6 months, wondering if God had her current address. The second appearance came 3 days later while I was browsing the used bookstore near my office during lunch break, the kind of place that smelled like old paper and forgotten dreams and reminded me of afternoons spent hiding in library stacks as a child. I pulled a random novel from the shelf, something about a woman starting over after divorce, which felt appropriately meta, and a bookmark fluttered to the floor like a small prayer flag. When I bent to pick it up, there was Zephaniah 3:17 again, this time decorated with watercolor flowers and written in the kind of calligraphy that suggested someone had taken time to make this beautiful, had believed these words were worth preserving and sharing. The bookmark was worn around the edges, obviously well loved, and I found myself wondering about its journey, whose hands had held it, whose heart had needed these exact words, whose story had intersected with this particular promise about God's unfailing love. I bought the book just to keep the bookmark, which felt like the kind of small theft that God might forgive, and that night I taped it to my bathroom mirror where I would see it every morning while brushing my teeth and practicing my church face. By the fourth appearance, this time on a Christian radio station that my car had somehow tuned itself to during my commute home from work, I was beginning to suspect that someone was trying to get my attention in the most persistent, gentle way possible. The radio DJ had been talking about feeling forgotten by friends and family, about the loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who don't really see you. And then he said, "I want to share something that might encourage those of you who feel invisible today," and proceeded to read Zephaniah 3:17 in its entirety, emphasizing the phrase, "He will take great delight in you," like he was speaking directly to the woman driving alone on Interstate 35 with tears streaming down her face. I had to pull over at a gas station to collect myself, sitting in my car watching strangers pump gas and buy lottery tickets and live their normal Wednesday evening lives, while I processed the possibility that the God of the universe might actually delight in me, might find something worth celebrating in the broken woman who couldn't even make. Friends at church, the thing about emotional archaeology is that once you start digging, you uncover layers you didn't know existed, patterns buried so deep you thought they were just part of your personality rather than responses to trauma you never properly grieved. Sitting in my apartment that evening, still shaken by the radio incident, I found myself thinking about the last time someone had genuinely delighted in me, had looked at me with joy rather than obligation or polite tolerance. The memory came back in pieces, like fragments of a dream that resurfaced throughout the day. I was 8 years old, standing in the children's choir loft at First Methodist Church, wearing a white dress with blue ribbons that my mother had ironed that morning, singing "Jesus Loves Me," with the kind of confidence that only comes from believing it completely. My grandmother sat in the second pew, her face radiant with pride, mouthing the words along with me. And after the service she told everyone within earshot that I had the voice of an angel and the heart of a worshiper. That was before the divorce, before the church split, before the moving from congregation to congregation like refugees seeking asylum in a war zone of adult disappointment and theological disagreements. My parents' divorce, when I was 10, had been more than the end of a marriage. It had been the dismantling of a community, the fracturing of relationships that I had assumed were permanent fixtures in my young world. The church we attended together as a family suddenly became a battlefield where taking sides was expected, and Switzerland wasn't an option, where longtime friends were forced to choose between my mother's version of events and my father's, where even the pastor seemed to pick favorites based on who tithed more regularly and caused fewer problems for the board of directors. I remember the Sunday morning when Mrs. Patterson, a different Mrs. Patterson at a different church, but they all seemed to blend together after a while, pulled me aside after children's church and explained in the kind of whisper adults use when they're sharing secrets that shouldn't be secrets that my father wouldn't be helping with the youth group anymore, that some decisions had been made for the good of everyone involved, that I should probably sit with my mother from now on instead of trying to find my dad in the sanctuary. What they don't prepare children for is the way divorce doesn't just split families. It splits churches, communities, entire universes of belonging that suddenly become territories to be divided rather than homes to be shared. We started attending different congregations after that, church hopping like tourists, sampling local culture, never staying long enough to put down roots or build relationships that might weather the storms of adult complexity. My mother preferred churches that validated her spiritual superiority, places where she could present herself as the long-suffering saint who had been betrayed by a man who had lost his way, while my father disappeared into the kind of casual Christianity that shows up for Christmas and Easter and keeps its spiritual seeking private and safe. Neither of them seemed to notice that their daughter was drowning in the space between their competing narratives, that I had internalized the message that loving me required choosing sides, that being worthy of community meant being perfect enough to avoid causing complications for people who were supposed to love you unconditionally. The pattern continued through my teenage years and into adulthood. Always the outsider, always the one who didn't quite fit, always carrying the invisible weight of wondering what was wrong with me, that even Christians found me too much work. I became an expert at reading social dynamics, at detecting the subtle signs that my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, at protecting myself by leaving before I could be asked to go. When I met David in college, I thought I had finally found someone who delighted in me the way my grandmother had when I was 8, someone who saw past my complicated family history and chronic overthinking to find something worth celebrating. But even that relationship had been built on a foundation of performance. I became the girlfriend who never needed anything, who supported his dreams while quietly abandoning my own, who learned to make herself smaller and smaller until there was almost nothing left to love or leave. The divorce papers had been signed on a Tuesday in March, 8 months before I first walked into Cornerstone Baptist Church, and I remember sitting in the lawyer's office wondering if this was what freedom was supposed to feel like, empty, untethered, like a balloon released into the sky with no destination in mind. David had been kind about it, which somehow made it worse than if he had been cruel, explaining that he loved me but wasn't in love with me, that he needed space to find himself, that our relationship had become more like a comfortable friendship than a passionate marriage. He was right, of course, which made the rejection sting even more sharply. I had failed at being a wife, not because I was terrible, but because I was boring, not because I was too much, but because I wasn't enough, not because I caused drama, but because I had become so good at disappearing that even my husband had stopped noticing I was there. That's when I started my journey back to church, convinced that faith communities would be different from the rest of the world, that people who claimed to follow Jesus would somehow be immune to the casual cruelty of everyday indifference. I visited 12 different congregations before settling on Cornerstone, drawn by Pastor Williams's sermon series on second chances and the way the congregations sang together like they actually meant the words. The building itself felt sacred in the way old churches do, with worn wooden pews that had absorbed decades of prayers and tears, stained glass windows that painted everything in jewel tones, an altar rail that suggested this was a place where people brought their broken hearts and left with hope. I had been so hopeful that first Sunday, so ready to believe that this time would be different, that this community would see past my divorce and loneliness to find someone worth including in their circle of care. But here I was, 6 months later, recognizing patterns that went back to childhood, understanding that my current church loneliness wasn't an isolated incident, but the latest chapter in a lifelong story of existing on the margins of communities that preached about unconditional love while practicing very conditional acceptance. The realization should have been devastating, but instead it felt oddly liberating, like finally naming a disease you've been carrying for years without understanding why you felt sick all the time. I wasn't the problem, or at least, I wasn't the only problem. The problem was bigger than my personality, older than my divorce, deeper than my inability to make small talk with strangers who seemed determined to remain strangers. The problem was generational, systemic, spiritual, a pattern of abandonment that had been passed down like an inheritance I never asked for, but couldn't seem to refuse. My mother called that Thursday evening, the way she did every few weeks, and for the first time in months I found myself really listening to her voice instead of just waiting for the conversation to end. She asked about work, about my apartment, about whether I was taking vitamins and getting enough sleep, but she didn't ask about church, didn't inquire about my spiritual life or social connections. And I realized that she had never modeled what healthy community looked like because she had never experienced it herself. Her own spiritual journey had been a series of false starts and disappointed hopes, churches that promised family but delivered judgment, pastors who preached grace but practiced condemnation, communities that claimed to welcome everyone but somehow always found reasons to exclude the people who needed them most. She had passed down to me not just her brown eyes and her tendency toward anxiety, but also her deep suspicion that belonging was something other people experienced, that acceptance was a gift given to everyone except us, that love, even divine love, always came with conditions we couldn't quite meet. That night, lying in bed staring at the ceiling while rain drummed against my bedroom window, I found myself praying for the first time in weeks. Not the desperate prayers of Sunday morning desperation, but something quieter, more honest, more like a conversation with someone who might actually be listening. God, I whispered into the darkness, I don't know how to do this anymore. I don't know how to keep hoping for human connection when every attempt feels like touching a hot stove. I don't know how to believe in community when I've never really experienced it. I don't know how to trust that you delight in me when your people find me forgettable. Help me understand what those verses mean. Help me know if you're really speaking to me or if I'm just so lonely that I'm manufacturing divine encounters out of random coincidences. The prayer felt rusty, like using muscles that had atrophied from disuse, but it also felt necessary, like finally allowing myself to breathe after holding my breath for months. The answer came the next Sunday in the most unexpected way, through Mr. Rodriguez, the church janitor, whose existence I had barely acknowledged during my 6 months of back pew dwelling. I arrived at my usual 6 a.m. time to find him mopping the sanctuary floor, moving slowly between the pews with the methodical care of someone who understood that cleaning could be a form of prayer, that preparing sacred space was itself a sacred act. He looked up when I entered, and instead of the polite nod I had come to expect from church employees, he smiled with genuine warmth and said, "Buenos dias, señora. You're always here early. I pray for you every Sunday when I clean your pew." His English was careful, deliberate, and his words hit me with the force of an unexpected gift. Someone had been praying for me. Someone had noticed my consistent presence. Someone had included me in his spiritual practice without my knowledge or permission. "You pray for me?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended, and he nodded with the kind of certainty that comes from intimate familiarity with divine presence. "See, every Sunday. I see you sitting alone, and I ask Dios to comfort you, to help you find what you are looking for in this place." He continued mopping, but his words hung in the air like incense, filling the sanctuary with something that felt like presence, like acknowledgement, like the first real evidence I had received that my existence mattered to someone in this building. We didn't talk long. Mr. Rodriguez had work to finish and I had floral patterns to count. But as I settled into my usual pew that morning, I felt something shift in my understanding of what it meant to be seen. Maybe visibility didn't always look like dinner invitations and committee assignments. Maybe sometimes it looked like an elderly janitor who understood that prayer was the most practical response to human suffering, who had been including me in his conversations with God long before I realized I needed intercession. That Sunday's sermon was about Hagar, the woman who named God the one who sees me after encountering divine presence in her wilderness exile. And I found myself wondering if Mr. Rodriguez was my Hagar moment, proof that God had been watching my back pew solitude all along, that my invisibility to the congregation didn't equal invisibility to the one who had created me. Pastor Williams spoke about how God often chooses to reveal himself through unexpected messengers, through people society overlooks or undervalues, through encounters that happen in margins rather than center stage. As he talked, I kept glancing at the sanctuary doors where Mr. Rodriguez would occasionally appear, checking supplies or adjusting thermostat settings, and I marveled at how I had been so focused on gaining recognition from the congregation that I had completely missed the recognition I was already receiving from someone who understood that service and prayer were inseparable practices. After the service, as I made my usual quick exit during the closing hymn, I found Mr. Rodriguez emptying wastebaskets in the fellowship hall, and I approached him with the kind of nervous energy that comes from stepping outside your comfort zone. "Mr. Rodriguez," I said, and he looked up with those same kind eyes that had seen me when I thought no one was looking. "Thank you for praying for me. I didn't know, but it means more than you can imagine." He smiled and reached into his supply cart, pulling out a small card that looked like it had been handled many times, creased from being carried in pockets and wallets and prayer books. "This is for you," he said, pressing it into my hand. "Zephaniah 3:17. Es mi verso favorito, my favorite verse. God sings over you, Señora, even when you cannot hear the music." I looked down at the card and felt something crack open in my chest, some frozen place that had been thawing since the dove incident, but hadn't quite melted until this moment. There was the verse again, the one that had been following me through coffee shops and bookstores and radio stations, but this time it came with human hands and a grandfather's smile, and the kind of love that asks for nothing in return. This time it came with the understanding that God's voice doesn't always sound like what we expect. Sometimes it sounds like an elderly janitor who speaks careful English and sees invisible women and prays for strangers while mopping sanctuary floors. This time, it came with the realization that I had been looking for divine love in all the wrong places, scanning faces in the congregation for signs of acceptance while missing the acceptance that was being offered quietly, consistently, faithfully by someone I had dismissed as part of the furniture. Driving home that Sunday, I found myself thinking about all the ways God might have been speaking to me that I had missed because I was listening for the wrong frequency, watching for the wrong signals, expecting divine love to look like human love instead of something altogether more surprising and subversive. Maybe the dove hadn't been a random bird moment, but a carefully orchestrated reminder that someone was paying attention to my story. Maybe the repeated appearances of Zephaniah 3:17 weren't coincidences, but love letters written in the margins of ordinary life. Maybe Mr. Rodriguez's prayers had been creating a protective circle around my back pew solitude, a sacred space where God could work on my heart without interference from human agendas or congregational politics. Maybe I had been receiving exactly what I needed all along, just not in the package I expected, or from the people I thought should deliver it. That week, for the first time since starting my Sunday morning ritual, I found myself looking forward to church, not because I hoped for human connection, but because I was curious about what other divine whispers I might have been missing, what other unexpected messengers might be carrying pieces of God's heart in their pockets, what other ways the one who sees me might choose to make his presence known. The emotional numbness was beginning to thaw, giving way to something that felt tentatively like hope. Not hope for the congregation to suddenly transform into the welcoming community I had imagined, but hope that God was weaving a different kind of story than the one I thought I was living. A story where being overlooked by people made space for being overseen by the one who had been singing over me since before I knew I needed a song. I started paying attention differently after that, noticing details I had previously overlooked in my focus on what was missing from my church experience. The way afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows, painting everything in shades of promise. The sound of children's laughter drifting up from Sunday school classrooms, reminding me that joy was possible even in places that felt joyless to me. The worn spots on pew cushions that spoke of decades of people bringing their whole selves to this sacred space, leaving behind invisible traces of prayers and tears and hopes that had soaked into the very fabric of the building. The flowers that appeared each week at the altar, arranged by hands I never saw, but which spoke of devotion that required no recognition, beauty offered for its own sake rather than for applause or appreciation. I began to understand that my 6 months of back pew solitude hadn't been wasted time but preparation time, a season of spiritual stripping away that was revealing what remained when all the human validation was removed, when all the social scaffolding was taken down, when all the external sources of identity and worth were exposed as insufficient. What remained was a heart that still believed despite disappointment, a soul that still showed up despite rejection, a faith that might be bruised but wasn't broken, a woman who was learning that sometimes you have to lose your life to find it, that sometimes you have to experience human abandonment to discover divine faithfulness, that sometimes the wilderness is exactly where you need to be to hear God's voice clearly for the first time. The archaeology of wounds was revealing not just patterns of pain, but also patterns of grace, not just inherited trauma, but also inherited resilience, not just the story of being forgotten, but also the story of being remembered by the one who counts every hair and collects every tear and knows the end of the story, even when the middle feels like an endless corridor of loneliness and confusion. I was beginning to suspect that my story wasn't ending with back pew isolation, but was just getting started, that all of this preparation had been leading somewhere I couldn't yet see, but was being invited to trust, that the God who delights in me had plans for this loneliness that went beyond my ability to imagine or orchestrate or control. The Tuesday night I finally lost my mind was 3 weeks after Mr. Rodriguez gave me the Zephaniah card, on one of those November evenings when darkness falls like a curtain at 5 p.m. and the whole world feels like it's holding its breath before winter settles in for good. I had been carrying his words around like a talisman. God sings over you, Señora. But the music he promised seemed to be playing on a frequency I couldn't tune into, and the cognitive dissonance between what I was supposed to believe and what I actually experienced was creating a pressure in my chest that felt like slowly drowning in air. Have you ever reached that breaking point where being polite to God feels more dishonest than being angry with him? Where the spiritual platitudes you've been feeding yourself suddenly taste like sawdust? Where the gap between what you've been told about divine love and what you've actually experienced becomes so wide you could drive a truck through it? That's where I found myself at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, sitting in my apartment with Mr. Rodriguez's card in one hand and my volunteer key to the church building in the other, making a decision that felt equal parts desperate and necessary. I was going to break into God's house and have it out with him once and for all. No audience, no performance, no pretending that everything was fine when everything felt fundamentally broken. The key had been given to me during my brief stint helping with wedding setup, back when I still believed that volunteering might earn me a place in the inner circle, and I had forgotten to return it after realizing that even service couldn't purchase the belonging I craved. The church building at midnight felt like a different creature entirely from the Sunday morning version I knew so well. Shadows stretched across familiar spaces in unfamiliar ways, the absence of human voices making every creak and whisper of the building feel amplified and somehow supernatural. I let myself in through the side door near the kitchen, moving through hallways that smelled like coffee and old hymnals and decades of prayers, feeling like an intruder, even though I had a key, even though I had been faithfully occupying space in this building for months, even though my tithe checks helped pay for the electricity that was lighting my way to the sanctuary. The darkness was complete, except for the emergency exit signs and the pale glow from streetlights filtering through stained glass windows, creating patterns on the floor that looked like abstract art painted in shades of loneliness and holy expectation. I made my way to the sanctuary and sat down in my usual back pew, but the familiar space felt charged with possibility in a way it never did on Sunday mornings when it was filled with people who knew how to perform faith better than I did. Here, in the empty darkness, there was no congregation to impress, no pastor to nod along with, no social dynamics to navigate or spiritual performance to maintain. Just me and the God who supposedly delighted in me, but seemed to express that delight in ways so subtle I wondered if I was imagining the whole thing. The silence was different here too, not the awkward silence of being ignored, but the expectant silence of a stage waiting for actors, a blank page waiting for words, a question waiting for an answer that might finally make sense of 6 months of backpew confusion and divine breadcrumb trails that led nowhere I could see. "Okay, God," I said out loud, my voice echoing in the empty space like an accusation looking for someone to blame. "Here we are, just you and me. No witnesses, no church people to scandalize with my lack of faith or improper theology or whatever it is about me that makes your children find me so forgettable. I've been coming here for 6 months, faithfully, consistently, desperately, and I still don't understand what you want from me, or what I'm supposed to be learning from this cosmic practical joke you seem to be playing where you send me Bible verses through coffee receipts and janitors, but can't manage to help one single person in this congregation remember my name. The words poured out of me like water from a broken dam, months of careful spiritual politeness giving way to raw honesty that felt both terrifying and necessary, both sacrilegious, and somehow more sacred than any prayer I had offered during official church services. I've been faithful, I continued, standing up and pacing between the pews like a lawyer presenting evidence to a jury that might or might not be listening. I've shown up every Sunday, even when it felt like emotional suicide. I've tithed, even when I could barely afford groceries. I've volunteered for your events and smiled at your people and pretended that being invisible was somehow part of your perfect plan for my life. And what do I have to show for it? A business card with a Bible verse and the questionable friendship of a janitor who probably prays for everyone because that's what good Christians do, not because there's anything special about me that caught your attention. The words tasted bitter as they left my mouth, sharp with years of accumulated disappointment and confusion about why God's love seemed so theoretical, so distant, so completely different from the personal, intimate relationship other believers described with such confidence and joy. I found myself walking toward the front of the sanctuary, drawn by some combination of boldness and recklessness that felt like liquid courage mixed with liquid desperation. And when I reached the altar rail, I turned around to face the empty pews as if I were addressing a congregation of ghosts. "You know what I think?" I said, my voice bouncing off the walls and ceiling like verbal ping-pong balls. "I think you're either not real, not good, or not interested. Because a God who is all three of those things wouldn't let his daughter sit alone in his house for 6 months while his family pretends she doesn't exist. A God who delights in his children wouldn't design a system where the people who need love the most are the ones who get it the least. A God who sings over his beloved wouldn't let the music be so quiet that she starts to wonder if she's going deaf or if there's just no song being sung." The silence that followed my accusation felt thick and pregnant with possibility, like the moment before thunder when you can feel electricity in the air but don't know where the lightning will strike. I stood there at the front of the empty sanctuary, breathing hard from the exertion of finally saying what I had been thinking for months, waiting for some kind of response. A voice, a sign, a gentle breeze that would indicate God had heard my complaint and was preparing a defense. Instead, I got something I wasn't expecting, a clear view of myself reflected in the dark windows behind the altar, a woman standing alone in an empty church at midnight, arms crossed defensively across her chest, face twisted with anger and pain and years of accumulated spiritual disappointment. The reflection was brutal in its honesty. I looked like someone who had been fighting a war she couldn't win, someone who had been carrying wounds so long they had become part of her posture, someone who had built walls so high and thick that even divine love might have trouble scaling them. My hair was disheveled from running my hands through it during my rant, my eyes were red from tears I hadn't realized I was crying, and my whole body seemed to be vibrating with the kind of tension that comes from holding too much pain for too long without any safe place to release it. But more than that, looking at my reflection in those windows, I saw something that made me step back in shock. I saw my mother, 25 years ago, standing in the kitchen of my childhood home, raging at a God who had let her marriage fall apart and her church family abandon her and her dreams dissolve into the kind of bitterness that gets passed down through generations, like an inheritance nobody wants, but everybody receives. "Oh," I whispered, sinking onto the front pew as understanding hit me like cold water in the face. "Oh no, I'm becoming her. I'm becoming the woman who blames God for human failures, who expects divine love to look like human acceptance, who mistakes God's presence for people's performance." The realization was devastating and liberating at the same time. Devastating because it meant I had been looking for God in all the wrong places. Liberating because it meant the problem wasn't with God's love, but with my expectations of how that love should be delivered and expressed and experienced. I had been so focused on being seen by the congregation that I had missed being seen by the one who mattered most, so desperate for human validation that I had dismissed divine affirmation as coincidence or wishful thinking. I pulled Mr. Rodriguez's card out of my pocket and read it again in the dim light filtering through stained glass. The Lord your God is with you, the mighty warrior who saves. He will take great delight in you. In his love he will no longer rebuke you, but will rejoice over you with singing. Word by word, I began to dissect what this promise actually meant, rather than what I had been assuming it should mean. The Lord your God is with you, not with the congregation, not with the people who seem to have their spiritual lives figured out, but with me, personally, individually, specifically. With you, in the back pew, in the loneliness, in the midnight sanctuary showdowns, in the places where I felt most abandoned and forgotten. The mighty warrior who saves. Saves from what? From the need for human approval? From the tyranny of others' opinions? From the prison of performing for love that was already freely given? He will take great delight in you, not in who I might become if I tried harder or performed better or made myself more acceptable to church people, but in who I was right now, in this moment, angry and confused and standing in an empty sanctuary at midnight, having a theological breakdown. The word delight felt foreign in the context of my self-understanding. When was the last time anyone had delighted in me? When was the last time I had delighted in myself? When was the last time I had believed that delight was something I deserved, rather than something I had to earn through good behavior and spiritual performance and making myself convenient for other people's comfort? In his love, he will no longer rebuke you. No more shame, no more condemnation, no more measuring myself against standards that seem designed to keep me feeling inadequate and striving and never quite good enough, but will rejoice over you with singing. And there it was, the song Mr. Rodriguez had promised, the music I had been straining to hear but couldn't detect, because I had been listening for it in human voices, in congregational acceptance, in committee invitations and coffee dates and birthday acknowledgments that never came. The song wasn't being sung by the people around me. It was being sung over me by the God who had been present in every lonely Sunday, every disappointing interaction, every moment when I felt forgotten by everyone who mattered. The song was in the dove that landed on my windshield, in the repeated appearances of this exact verse, in the janitor who prayed for invisible women while mopping sanctuary floors, in the persistent divine whispers that kept reaching for me, even when I was too hurt to reach back. I found myself on my knees at the altar rail, not because someone had called for an altar call or because I was following proper church protocol, but because the weight of understanding was too heavy to carry standing up. For 6 months, I had been coming to this place looking for human love disguised as divine love, seeking acceptance from people who were just as broken and needy and human as I was, expecting the congregation to be the source of validation that only God could provide. I had been treating church like a social club that kept rejecting my application instead of a hospital where broken people came to be healed by a God who specialized in making the wounded whole. I had been so focused on being chosen by them that I had missed the reality that I was already chosen by Him, so desperate to be included in their circle that I had overlooked the fact that I was already included in the only circle that ultimately mattered. "I'm sorry," I whispered into the darkness, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was apologizing for, expecting too much from people, expecting too little from God, missing the song because I was listening for the wrong singer, blaming the Almighty for the limitations of the merely human. I'm sorry for not knowing how to receive love that doesn't look like what I expected. I'm sorry for measuring your faithfulness by their response. I'm sorry for sitting in the back pew nursing wounds instead of worshiping the one who was sitting right beside me the whole time. The words felt rusty, unfamiliar, like speaking a language I had once known but had forgotten through disuse, but they also felt necessary, like finally telling the truth after months of pretending everything was fine when everything felt fundamentally wrong. That's when I heard it, not audibly, not in a way that would convince skeptics or provide evidence for doubters, but clearly, personally, unmistakably. Daughter, you have been looking for me in their acceptance. I have been with you in their rejection. You have been seeking my love in their inclusion. I have been loving you in their exclusion. You have been listening for my voice in their words. I have been singing over you in the silence. The words came like water to someone dying of thirst, like sunrise after the longest night, like the first breath after nearly drowning, and I found myself sobbing in a way I hadn't since the day my divorce papers were signed. Not tears of grief this time, but tears of recognition, relief, homecoming. Your loneliness has been your invitation to intimacy with me, the voice continued, gentle but firm, loving but uncompromising. Your rejection by them has been your protection from depending on them. Your invisibility to people has been your opportunity to be seen by me. I have been singing over you every Sunday morning, every midnight breakdown, every moment when you wondered if anyone cared whether you lived or died. The song is not loud because it is meant for your ears alone, not because it is weak, but because it is personal, not because I am distant, but because I am closer than your own heartbeat. The words wrapped around me like a blanket, like arms that had been waiting to hold me for months, like the embrace I had been seeking in handshakes and polite conversations and committee meetings that never materialized. I stayed on my knees at that altar rail for what felt like hours, having the conversation with God I should have had months ago, the honest, messy, complicated dialogue that real relationships require, but that I had been too proud or too hurt or too polite to initiate. I told him about the loneliness that felt like slowly suffocating, about the birthdays that passed unnoticed, about the homemade lasagna that nobody wanted, about the dreams of community that had turned into nightmares of isolation. I confessed my anger at being overlooked, my bitterness toward people who seemed to have effortless access to the belonging I craved, my frustration with a God who seemed to speak in whispers when I needed him to shout. And in return, I listened, really listened, for the first time in months, not for the voices of people who might finally see me, but for the voice of the one who had never stopped seeing me, never stopped singing, never stopped delighting in the daughter who had spent so long looking for love in all the wrong places. You are not what happened to you, he said, and I felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of identity, purpose, worth. You are not the sum of others' responses to you. You are not defined by their inability to see what I see, their failure to love what I love, their limitations in recognizing the treasure I have placed in this earthen vessel. You are my beloved daughter, chosen before the foundation of the world, delighted in beyond your ability to comprehend, sung over with joy that human language cannot contain. The words were rewiring my neural pathways, restructuring my self-concept, rebuilding my foundation from the ground up. For 34 years, I'd been constructing my identity on the shifting sand of human approval, measuring my worth by external validation, believing that love was something I had to earn rather than something I was born deserving. I am not what they think I am, I realized, speaking the words out loud as they formed in my heart. I am not what my ex-husband decided I was. I am not what this congregation sees or doesn't see. I am not the sum of my failures, my disappointments, my unmet expectations. I am not too much or too little or too complicated or too broken. I am exactly who you created me to be, exactly who you love, exactly who you delight in, exactly who you sing over. The declaration felt like throwing off chains I hadn't realized I was wearing, like stepping out of a prison cell whose door had been unlocked the whole time, like discovering that the treasure I had been searching for everywhere else had been buried in my own backyard all along. The sanctuary around me seemed to shimmer with possibility as my perspective shifted from scarcity to abundance, from rejection to acceptance, from invisibility to beloved visibility in the eyes that mattered most. The empty pews that had felt like evidence of my isolation now felt like sacred space where God and I could have uninterrupted conversations. The silence that had felt like abandonment now felt like sanctuary. The loneliness that had felt like punishment now felt like invitation to discover what relationship with God looked like when it wasn't filtered through human expectations or mediated by congregational approval or dependent on committee assignments for validation. I don't know how long I stayed there, kneeling at the altar rail in the empty sanctuary, but when I finally stood up, my knees were stiff, and my heart was different, and my relationship with that building had been fundamentally transformed. This was no longer the place where I came to seek acceptance from people who might never offer it. This was the place where I came to receive love from the one who had been offering it all along. This was no longer the weekly reminder of what I was missing. This was the sacred space where I could encounter what I already had. This was no longer the scene of my spiritual failure. This was the altar where my true identity had been revealed and my divine worth had been established and my eternal belonging had been confirmed. Walking back through those dark hallways toward the side door, I felt like a different person than the one who had entered with angry questions and desperate demands. I was still the same woman with the same circumstances, still the divorced church member who sat alone in the back pew, still the person who didn't quite fit into the established social patterns of Cornerstone Baptist Church. But I was also something else now, something more. I was the daughter who had heard her father's song, the beloved who had received divine delight, the chosen one who no longer needed to earn what had been freely given from the beginning. The Midnight Sanctuary Showdown hadn't changed my external circumstances, but it had revolutionized my internal landscape, replacing the foundation of human approval with the bedrock of divine love that no congregation could give and no committee could take away. Driving home through empty streets at 2 a.m., I found myself humming. Not a hymn from Sunday service or a song from the radio, but something new, something that felt like it was being composed in real time, something that sounded like joy mixed with relief, mixed with the kind of peace that comes from finally understanding the rules of a game you've been playing wrong your whole life. The music was coming from somewhere deep inside me, from a place that had been silent for so long I'd forgotten it existed, and I realized this might be what it felt like when someone who had been sung over for months finally learned to sing along. The song wasn't complicated or particularly beautiful, but it was mine. It was real, and it was the first music I had made in years that wasn't performed for an audience, but simply expressed because it couldn't be contained. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Not because my circumstances had changed, but because my understanding of those circumstances had been completely transformed. Tomorrow, I would still drive to Cornerstone Baptist Church, still sit in the back left pew, still watch families greet each other with warmth I might never personally experience. But I would no longer be sitting there as an outsider hoping to be invited in. I would be sitting there as someone who already belonged to the family that mattered most, someone who carried divine delight in her heart, someone who knew she was being sung over even when she couldn't hear the melody. The back pew was no longer my place of exile. It was my place of encounter, no longer evidence of rejection, but invitation to intimacy. No longer proof that I didn't matter, but sacred space where I could meet with the one for whom I mattered more than I could possibly comprehend. The Sunday following my Midnight Sanctuary encounter felt like returning to a familiar movie theater to watch a film I thought I knew by heart, only to discover that someone had changed the script, relit the scenes, and somehow transformed the entire story without touching a single prop or moving a single chair. I arrived at my usual 6 a.m. time, claimed my customary back left pew, and settled into the routine that had defined my spiritual life for 6 months. But everything looked different now. Not because the sanctuary had changed, but because I was seeing it through eyes that had been washed clean by divine tears and recalibrated by midnight revelations about whose opinion actually mattered. Have you ever experienced that strange phenomenon of retroactive recognition when you suddenly see patterns that were always there but somehow invisible until the exact moment you developed the eyes to perceive them? As I sat in my pew that morning, watching the familiar choreography of Sunday morning preparation unfold around me, I began to notice details that had been hiding in plain sight for months, divine breadcrumbs scattered throughout my journey that I had dismissed as coincidence or overlooked entirely in my desperate focus on human acknowledgement. The parking spot that was always available exactly where I needed it, not the closest spot, which would have required interaction with other early arrivals, but the perfect middle-distance space that allowed me to slip in quietly without drawing attention to my consistent solitude. I'd attributed this to luck or timing, but now I wondered if someone had been orchestrating even this small detail, providing exactly what I needed when I needed it, caring for my heart's requirement for invisibility during a season when visibility felt too dangerous to risk. The morning light, that streamed through the stained glass window directly above my pew, painting my folded hands in shades of purple and gold every Sunday around 7:30 a.m., just as my anxiety about the approaching service would begin to peak and my heart would start its familiar Sunday morning whisper of, maybe I should just leave before anyone notices I'm here. I had always thought it was simply the angle of the sun and the time of year, but sitting there with my new eyes, I realized this was a weekly gift, a tangible reminder that I was seen and known and somehow held by the same God who hung the sun in the sky and timed its light to reach one lonely woman in exactly the moment she needed to remember that she was not forgotten. Week after week, that light had been a divine embrace that I had received without recognizing, comfort that I had experienced without acknowledging its source, evidence of love that I had dismissed as atmospheric accident because I was too busy scanning faces for human recognition to notice divine attention. Mr. Rodriguez's consistent presence during my early morning arrivals, which I had assumed was simply his work schedule, now revealed itself as something far more intentional and tender. He had been arriving early specifically to prepare sacred space for the woman who needed sanctuary, who required solitude, who was healing in ways that couldn't happen in crowds. His quiet nods, which I'd interpreted as polite acknowledgement between strangers, had actually been benedictions from someone who understood that sometimes love looks like bearing witness to another person's pain without trying to fix it or explain it or rush them through it. Every week he had been blessing my solitude, honoring my process, creating a container of prayer around my healing that I was only now beginning to understand. His early morning presence hadn't been coincidence. It had been ministry. Divine love expressed through human faithfulness, the kind of service that expects no recognition and receives no applause, but changes everything for the person who receives it. The children's voices that drifted up from the basement Sunday school rooms each week around 8:45, just as I would be settling into my pre-service meditation and trying to quiet my heart's familiar litany of, nobody sees you, nobody cares, nobody would miss you if you stopped coming. Those sweet, unguarded voices singing, Jesus loves me, and this little light of mine, with the kind of confidence that comes from believing completely in love that requires no performance, no earning, no proving. I had thought they were simply practicing for children's church, but now I understood they had been a weekly reminder of the faith I was supposed to be reclaiming, the trust I was supposed to be rebuilding, the simplicity I was supposed to be returning to. Week after week, those children had been unknowingly preaching sermons about unconditional love and unearned acceptance, their voices carrying truth up through the floor into my heart like incense rising to heaven. The fresh flowers that appeared each week at the altar, arrangements that changed with the seasons, and somehow always included at least one yellow bloom, daffodils in early spring, sunflowers in summer, chrysanthemums in fall, which I had noticed but never questioned, assuming they were simply part of the church's commitment to beauty and order. But yellow had been my grandmother's favorite color, the woman who had delighted in my 8-year-old voice in the children's choir, who had seen something precious in me before the world taught me to doubt my own worth. Every week, those yellow flowers had been a love letter from heaven, a reminder of the grandmother who had first shown me what it looked like when someone took genuine delight in my existence, a bridge between past love and present love, between human affection and divine affection, between the memory of being treasured and the reality of being treasured still. The sermon topics that had seemed to speak directly to my pain, abandonment, loneliness, God's faithfulness in wilderness seasons, the woman at the well who found living water in the middle of her isolation, Hagar, who discovered that God sees her in the desert. I had assumed Pastor Williams was simply working through a biblical series on marginalized women, but now I wondered if God had been orchestrating even this, speaking to my heart through prepared messages that addressed exactly what I was walking through, exactly when I needed to hear it. Week after week, the pulpit had been delivering targeted encouragement to the woman in the back pew who thought she was invisible, biblical truth aimed directly at wounds that only God knew I was carrying, scriptural comfort that met me precisely where I was hiding. The acoustic quirk of the sanctuary that allowed me to hear whispered prayers from the front rows while remaining inaudible myself, which I had initially found distracting and then learned to tune out, now revealed itself as divine grace. I had been included in the prayer life of the congregation without them knowing, had been receiving the overflow of their intercession, had been covered by petitions for healing and comfort and divine presence, even though I felt completely disconnected from their community. Mrs. Henderson's whispered prayers for her granddaughter's struggles with anxiety, Mr. Carlson's quiet requests for wisdom in his marriage, the youth pastor's wife's barely audible pleas for patience with difficult teenagers, all of it had been washing over me like a river of grace, connecting me to the spiritual life of the church in ways that social interaction never could. I had been part of their prayer life without knowing it, included in their spiritual family through divine design rather than human invitation. The way my usual Sunday routine had been perfectly timed to avoid the social pressures that would have overwhelmed me during this season of healing, arriving early enough to claim space without competition, leaving during the closing hymn to miss the fellowship time that would have felt like emotional torture, sitting in the spot that provided visibility to the exits when anxiety made staying feel impossible. I'd thought I was simply managing my social phobia and protecting my wounds, but now I realized God had been orchestrating even my self-protective instincts, allowing me to receive exactly what I could handle while shielding me from what would have been too much during my most vulnerable season. Every week, I had been held in a divine container that looked like isolation but was actually protection, that felt like loneliness but was actually sanctuary, that seemed like rejection but was actually refuge. The gradual increase in my capacity to stay for entire services, which had begun with slipping out during the first hymn and slowly progressed to remaining through the closing prayer. I had attributed this to growing familiarity with the routine, but now I could see it as spiritual healing happening incrementally, divine therapy that honored my pace and respected my process. God had been slowly rebuilding my ability to be in community without requiring me to perform community, had been gradually increasing my tolerance for being around people who didn't see me as preparation for eventually being around people who would see me clearly. Week by week, my soul had been gaining strength like a muscle recovering from injury, and the God who sang over me had been patient with every faltering step, every setback, every moment when healing felt impossible and hope felt naive. The books I had randomly pulled from, library shelves that all seemed to address themes of identity, belonging, divine love, spiritual resilience. I'd thought I was simply drawn to stories that reflected my experience, but now I wondered if God had been guiding even my reading choices, feeding my soul exactly the nutrients it needed during this season of spiritual starvation. The bookmark with Zephaniah 3:17 that had fluttered from a random novel hadn't been coincidence. It had been divine appointment, another piece of the intricate plan to convince one stubborn woman that she was seen, known, loved, and sung over by someone who had been orchestrating her healing long before she knew she needed it. Even my taste in literature had been redeemed, transformed into a delivery system for divine encouragement, proof that God could speak through any medium when he was determined to reach a daughter who desperately needed to hear his voice. Laati. The repetitive appearance of Zephaniah 3:17 in coffee shops, radio broadcasts, random conversations overheard in grocery store lines, social media posts that appeared in my feed at exactly the moments when I was questioning whether God's love was real or just wishful thinking. All of it had been a coordinated campaign to convince me of a truth my heart needed, but my mind kept rejecting. God had been pursuing me with the persistence of a lover writing love letters, determined to get his message through despite my skepticism and self-protection, and commitment to believing that I was somehow unworthy of the kind of attention he was lavishing on me. Every appearance of that verse had been another knock on the door of my heart, another invitation to believe that I was actually as beloved as he claimed, another piece of evidence that his delight in me was not conditional on my performance or dependent on others' recognition, but absolute, unchanging, eternal. The dreams I had been having for months but dismissing as subconscious processing, dreams of being held by invisible arms, of hearing music I couldn't identify, of walking through gardens where every flower knew my name, of sitting at tables where there was always a place set for me, of being seen and known and loved by someone whose face I couldn't see, but whose presence felt like home. I had attributed these to wishful thinking, to emotional need, creating imaginary comfort. But now I understood they had been divine visits, God showing up in the one space where my defenses were completely down, where my skepticism couldn't interfere with his love, where he could sing over me without my rational mind explaining away the melody. Night after night, he had been holding me while I slept, comforting me in the space between conscious and unconscious, loving me when I was too tired to resist or analyze or explain away his presence. The inexplicable sense of protection I had felt during my most vulnerable moments, walking to my car alone after evening services, driving home through empty streets after my midnight sanctuary encounter, sitting in my apartment during the darkest hours of depression, when ending my life felt like a reasonable option. I had assumed this was simply survival instinct or good luck or the random kindness of strangers, but now I recognized it as the mighty warrior who saves, the one who had been fighting battles on my behalf that I didn't even know were being waged, protecting me from dangers both seen and unseen, keeping me alive and functioning when my own strength was insufficient for the task. Every safe arrival home, every morning I chose to get out of bed, every Sunday I found the courage to walk back into that sanctuary despite the pain it often caused. All of it had been evidence of divine intervention, proof that I was being carried when I thought I was walking alone, sustained when I thought I was surviving on my own willpower. The physical sensations I had experienced during particularly difficult Sundays, the sudden warmth that would settle around my shoulders when anxiety threatened to overwhelm me, the inexplicable peace that would wash over me during communion despite my emotional turmoil, the sense of being held that I couldn't explain or dismiss. These had been divine embraces, God's presence manifesting in ways my body could recognize, even when my mind was resistant to supernatural explanations. Week after week, I had been receiving tangible comfort from an intangible source, physical evidence of spiritual reality, proof that the God who sang over me was close enough to touch, present enough to hold, real enough to provide exactly what I needed in the moments when human comfort was unavailable or insufficient. The people who had crossed my path during this season, not just Mr. Rodriguez, but the grocery store clerk, who always seemed to know when I needed an extra moment to find my wallet, the librarian who saved books she thought I might enjoy, the neighbor who left little gifts on my doorstep without ever identifying herself, the strangers who smiled at me during my lowest moments with exactly the warmth I needed, to remember that not all humans were sources of pain. I had thought these were simply kind people doing kind things, but now I could see the divine coordination behind these encounters, God using human hands to love me when I couldn't receive love directly, orchestrating moments of grace through people who might never know they had been part of a larger healing plan. Every small kindness had been a note in the song God was singing over me. Every unexpected gentleness had been his voice speaking through human vocal cords. Every moment of feeling seen by strangers had been preparation for recognizing how thoroughly seen I was by the one who had created me. The gradual shift in my prayer life, which had moved from desperate bargaining to honest complaint to tentative conversation to the beginning of genuine relationship. I had thought this was simply the natural progression of someone processing grief and disappointment, but now I realized it had been divine discipleship, God slowly teaching me how to communicate with him in ways that were authentic rather than performative, honest rather than polished, real rather than religious. He had been patient with my anger, gentle with my accusations, understanding of my confusion, never requiring me to clean up my spiritual language or pretend to have faith I didn't feel. Week by week, he had been transforming my prayer life from monologue to dialogue, from presentation to conversation, from performance to intimacy, proving that he preferred my honest doubt to my dishonest certainty, my real questions to my fake answers. The music that had begun playing in my head during the past few weeks, not songs I recognized from the radio or hymns from church services, but melodies that seemed to emerge from some deep place in my soul, wordless tunes that felt like hope set to rhythm, harmonies that sounded like home. I had assumed this was simply my mind's way of processing emotion through music, but sitting in that pew with my new understanding, I realized this was the song Mr. Rodriguez had told me God was singing over me, finally breaking through my defenses and making itself known in frequencies I could recognize and receive. The music wasn't imaginary. It was divine communication. God's joy over me translated into melodies my heart could understand, proof that the singing promised in Zephaniah 3:17 wasn't metaphorical but actual, not distant but intimate, not theoretical but practical evidence of divine delight that had been playing over me for months while I was straining to hear human applause. The sense of purpose that had been growing slowly but steadily, even in the midst of my loneliness. A feeling that this season of isolation was preparation for something, that the pain I was experiencing had meaning beyond my ability to understand, that God was developing something in me that required exactly this combination of solitude and sanctuary, exactly this kind of stripping away and building up, exactly this particular curriculum of divine love received in human isolation. I had fought against this sense of purpose, had insisted that suffering for its own sake was meaningless, and that God who loved me wouldn't orchestrate pain as a teaching tool. But now I was beginning to understand that he hadn't caused my rejection by the congregation. He had simply refused to waste it, had used their inability to see me as an opportunity for me to be seen by him, had transformed their failure to include me into an invitation to be included in something far more significant and lasting and beautiful. The increasing clarity about my own identity that had emerged from this season, not the identity I had been trying to construct based on others' responses to me, but the identity that had been mine from the beginning, before divorce and disappointment and desperate attempts to earn love through good behavior and spiritual performance. In the crucible of rejection, the false self had been burned away, leaving behind someone I was only now beginning to recognize, a woman who was funny and kind, and intelligent and worthy of love, not because she had earned these qualities, but because she had been created with them. A daughter who belonged not because she had found the right community, but because she had been chosen by the right father. A beloved who was seen not because she had figured out how to be visible, but because she had learned to recognize the one who had been watching. Her, all along. The profound gratitude that was beginning to replace the bitterness I had carried for months. Not gratitude for the pain itself, but gratitude for the way God had met me in the pain, not thankfulness for the rejection, but thankfulness for the way divine love had filled the spaces that human love had failed to fill. I was beginning to understand that this season of back-pew solitude hadn't been punishment or abandonment or evidence of my unworthiness, but had been the exact environment I needed for the kind of healing that could only happen in the presence of God, undiluted by human agenda or filtered through others' expectations or complicated by social dynamics that would have interfered with the delicate work he was doing in my heart. The isolation that had felt like exile was actually incubation. The loneliness that had felt like death was actually resurrection. The invisibility that had felt like evidence of my insignificance was actually proof of how significant I was to the one who had been willing to meet me in the margins, in the silence, in the empty spaces where his voice could be heard most clearly. "Do you see it now?" came the familiar voice, gentle but unmistakable, and I realized God was inviting me to look back over these 6 months, not as a victim, reviewing evidence of abandonment, but as a daughter recognizing proof of unfailing love, not as someone who had been forgotten, but as someone who had been so thoroughly remembered that every detail of her healing had been orchestrated with divine precision and infinite care. Do you see how I have been weaving your story, how I have been singing over you, how I have been delighting in you, even when you couldn't feel it, especially when you couldn't feel it? Do you see how your pain has been the invitation for my presence, how your rejection has been the context for my acceptance, how your invisibility to them has been your opportunity to be seen by me? The overwhelming gratitude that washed over me in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Not the polite thankfulness of good manners or the obligatory appreciation for obvious blessings, but the profound awe of someone who had just discovered that what she thought was a tragic accident had actually been a love story, that what she had interpreted as divine abandonment had actually been divine pursuit, that what had felt like spiritual failure had actually been spiritual breakthrough disguised as breakdown. Every Sunday morning for 6 months, I had been sitting in the presence of the God who delighted in me, had been receiving his love through 1,000 small kindnesses, had been held by his faithfulness even when I couldn't feel his arms around me. The song had been playing the entire time. I was just finally learning how to hear the melody, how to recognize the rhythm, how to understand that I was both the audience and the inspiration for music that had never stopped playing. I found myself laughing through tears as understanding flooded my heart, not bitter laughter, but the kind of joy that comes from discovering you've been rich all along but just hadn't learned how to recognize your wealth, that you've been loved all along but just hadn't developed eyes to see love in the forms it was taking. God had been courting me through coffee shop receipts and library bookmarks and janitor prayers and children's voices and stained glass light and fresh flowers and protective warmth and inexplicable peace and midnight encounters that changed everything while changing nothing except my ability to see what had always been true. I was the daughter he delighted in, the beloved he sang over, the chosen one who belonged not because I had found my way into his family, but because I had been born into it. Not because I had earned my place, but because my place had been prepared before the foundation of the world. The back pew that had felt like exile now felt like a throne, the perfect vantage point for someone who was learning to see with divine eyes, to hear with spiritual ears, to recognize love in forms that didn't require human mediation or congregational approval. This was where I belonged, not because I wasn't good enough for the front rows, but because this was where God could love me most clearly, where his voice could reach me most directly, where his song could play without interference from the noise of human opinion and social expectation. I had been sitting in the perfect seat all along, receiving exactly what I needed from exactly the source that could provide it, learning to be loved by the one whose love never failed, never disappointed, never required performance or improvement or anything other than the willingness to receive what was, being freely given. The identity that was crystallizing in my heart felt both brand new and ancient, like recovering something I had lost long ago, like remembering who I had been before the world taught me who I should be. I was Sarah Thompson, beloved daughter of the Most High God, delighted in beyond measure, sung over with joy, seen with perfect clarity, known with intimate detail, loved with unfailing faithfulness. I was not the woman who couldn't make friends at church. I was the woman who was learning to be friends with God. I was not the person who didn't fit into existing communities. I was the person who belonged to the community of heaven. I was not the rejected, forgotten, overlooked woman in the back pew. I was the chosen, remembered, carefully watched daughter who had been invited into the most exclusive relationship in the universe. Not because I was perfect, but because I was perfectly loved, not because I had found God, but because God had never lost me. As the sanctuary began to fill with the usual Sunday morning crowd, I watched with new eyes, no longer scanning faces for signs of recognition, but marveling at the intricate ways God was loving each person who entered that sacred space, the individual stories of grace being written in hearts I couldn't see, the personal songs being sung over souls I might never know. The congregation that had felt like a closed circle now felt like a gallery where I could observe divine artistry in action, where I could witness the countless ways love was pursuing, healing, transforming, delighting in people who might not even realize they were being serenaded by heaven. My isolation from them had taught me intimacy with him. My rejection by the community had led to acceptance by the Creator. My invisibility to people had resulted in perfect visibility to the one who mattered most. And in that moment of retroactive recognition, of divine archaeology that revealed treasures buried in plain sight, I understood that everything was about to change. Not my circumstances, which might remain exactly the same, but my understanding of those circumstances, my relationship to this place and these people, and this God who had been loving me so persistently, so creatively, so completely, that I was only now beginning to comprehend the magnitude of the gift I had been receiving without knowing it. The back pew was about to become a launching pad, the sanctuary was about to become a mission field, and the woman who had spent 6 months learning to be loved was about to discover what it meant to love others with the same extravagant, unconditional, transformative love that had been healing her heart one Sunday morning at a time. The Sunday morning when everything changed forever began like any other. November 29th, 3 weeks after my midnight sanctuary encounter and divine archaeology session, with me arriving at Cornerstone Baptist Church at 6 a.m. to claim my back left pew. But this time, carrying something I had never brought before, the unshakable knowledge that I was already home, already belonged, already loved beyond measure by the one whose opinion was the only one that ultimately mattered. Have you ever experienced that strange sensation of returning to a familiar place after an internal earthquake has rearranged your entire emotional landscape, when everything looks exactly the same but feels completely different because you're seeing it through eyes that have been washed clean by divine revelation? That's how I felt walking into the sanctuary that morning. Same building, same pews, same stained glass windows, same early morning silence. But I was no longer the desperate woman seeking acceptance from a congregation that might never offer it. I was the beloved daughter coming home to meet with the Father who had been singing over me in this very space for months, while I was too distracted by human rejection to recognize divine presence. The back pew that had once felt like exile now felt like a throne room, the perfect place to commune with the King who had been holding court in my heart, transforming rejection into acceptance, loneliness into intimacy, invisibility into the most profound kind of being seen. I settled into my usual spot with something I hadn't carried in months, genuine peace, the kind that comes not from getting what you want, but from discovering that what you already have is infinitely better than what you thought you wanted. My phone was silent, as always, but the silence no longer felt like evidence of my social failure. It felt like sacred space protected from interruption, time set apart for the most important relationship in my life. My hands were empty of the desperate prayers I used to bring, the bargains I used to try to make with God about helping me fit in, helping me be noticed, helping me become the kind of person others might find worthy of inclusion. Instead, I was simply present, available, open to whatever God wanted to do in this space that had become our weekly meeting place, our sanctuary within the sanctuary, our private chapel where divine love could work without interference from human agendas or social expectations. The worship music that morning seemed to carry extra resonance, not because the musicians were playing differently, but because I was hearing differently, no longer straining to detect human approval in the harmony, but resting in the knowledge that the God of the universe was already applauding my existence, already delighting in my presence, already singing over me with joy that made earthly music pale in comparison. When we sang "Come as You Are," I finally understood what those words meant. Not come as you hope to become after you fix yourself, not come as you think you should be to deserve acceptance, but come exactly as you are right now, broken and healing and somewhere in the middle of becoming. Because that's exactly who God loves, exactly who He delights in, exactly who He has been waiting to embrace without condition or reservation or improvement plan. During the pastoral prayer, when Pastor Williams asked God to bless our church family and help us be a welcoming community, I found myself praying something I had never prayed before. Not that they would finally see me, but that I would see them with the same eyes of love that God had been using to see me, that I would recognize the loneliness hiding behind their confident facades, the hunger for belonging that masqueraded as social success, the wounds that made them form protective circles just as I had built protective walls. For the first time in 6 months, I was praying for the congregation rather than about the congregation, interceding for their healing rather than pleading for their acceptance, asking God to love them through me the way He had been loving me through Mr. Rodriguez, and stained glass light and divine whispers that transformed midnight breakdowns into sacred breakthroughs. That's when I saw her, a young woman, maybe late 20s, slipping through the sanctuary doors during the opening hymn, with the kind of careful movements that spoke of someone trying not to disturb anything or anyone, someone hoping to observe without being observed, someone carrying the particular type of hunger that I recognized immediately, because I had been carrying it myself for months. She paused at the back of the sanctuary, scanning the rows with the practiced eye of someone looking for the safest seat, the spot that would provide maximum invisibility while still technically participating in the service. And I watched her gaze settle on the back right pew, the mirror image of my own chosen territory. Something inside me shifted as I watched her settle into that familiar posture of hopeful isolation, shoulders slightly hunched to take up less space, purse clutched protectively in her lap, eyes determinedly focused forward to avoid the possibility of unwanted eye contact with congregation members who might feel obligated to greet her and then struggle to know what to say. She looked like me, I realized, with stunning clarity, not physically, because she was younger and blonde where I was brunette, taller and more conventionally pretty than I had ever been, but spiritually, emotionally, in the invisible ways that mattered most. She carried the same careful loneliness, the same desperate hope wrapped in protective skepticism, the same spiritual hunger that was fighting against years of disappointment and rejection, and the kind of wounds that make vulnerability feel dangerous rather than brave. I could see it in the way she held her body, the way she gripped her bulletin, the way her eyes darted briefly around the sanctuary before settling safely on the hymnal in front of her. She was me, 6 months ago, walking into this place with a heart full of hope and a history full of reasons to guard that hope carefully, looking for family in a room full of strangers who might or might not have space for one more broken person seeking healing. "Go to her," came the familiar divine whisper, gentle but unmistakable, and I felt my heart skip with the kind of holy fear that accompanies moments when God asks you to step outside your comfort zone and into His plan, when divine love requires human action, when being loved by God translates into loving others in ways that feel risky and necessary and completely outside your natural inclinations. My immediate response was resistance. I had just found my own footing in this place, had just learned to receive love without performing for it, had just discovered the peace of being known by God without needing to be known by people. Wasn't I supposed to sit in this new understanding for a while, to let it settle and solidify before attempting to extend to others what I was still learning to receive myself? But the divine prompting was persistent, patient but insistent, the kind of love that knows when we're ready for the next step even when we don't feel ready, that understands our healing is never meant to end with ourselves, but to flow through us to others who need exactly what we've just learned to receive. She is where you were, God continued, His voice carrying the tender authority of someone who sees the beginning and end of every story, who understands exactly what each heart needs and when it needs it. You know her loneliness because it has been your loneliness. You recognize her hunger because it has been your hunger. You see her invisibility because it has been your invisibility. What I have given you, give to her. What I have spoken over you, speak over her. What I have shown you about belonging, show her. She is not an interruption to your healing. She is the reason for your healing. And in that moment I understood that everything I had been through, the divorce that left me spiritually homeless, the months of church shopping that ended in disappointment, the 6 months of back pew solitude that felt like abandonment but was actually apprenticeship, all of it had been preparation for this moment, this opportunity to be the person I had needed someone to be for me. This invitation to love someone else with the same extravagant, unconditional, transformative love that had been healing my heart one divine whisper at a time. Moving from my back left pew to her back right pew felt like the longest walk of my life, each step requiring a conscious choice to trust that God's love was big enough to cover my nervousness, that His plan was better than my comfort, that His heart for this stranger was worth risking the awkward rejection that might come from approaching someone who had obviously chosen solitude for reasons I couldn't know but could certainly understand. As I walked across the back of the sanctuary during the second verse of "Great is Thy Faithfulness," I found myself praying the kind of desperate prayer that accompanies divine assignments. God, I have no idea what to say to her, no training in how to love strangers, no experience in being the answer to someone else's prayers instead of the person offering them. Help me not to project my own neediness onto her situation. Help me to see her with your eyes rather than mine. Help me to offer what you want to give her rather than what I think she needs or what I would have wanted someone to offer me. I settled into the pew beside her as quietly as possible, close enough to communicate intent, but far enough away to respect her obvious need for space, and immediately felt the familiar tension of someone who had been hoping to remain invisible, suddenly having their solitude interrupted by a stranger with unknown motives and uncertain social skills. She glanced at me briefly, offering the kind of polite smile that says, "Thank you for the gesture, but please don't feel obligated to talk to me." And I recognized the expression because I had perfected it myself over months of deflecting well-meaning but ultimately superficial attempts at church friendliness. For a moment, we sat in parallel silence, two women who had chosen the same Sunday morning survival strategy, both listening to Pastor Williams's sermon about God's heart for the marginalized, while wondering if we qualified for divine attention or were just fooling ourselves about being noticed by the Creator of the universe. During the pastoral prayer, I found myself praying not just for guidance about what to say to her, but for the courage to say anything at all, for the willingness to risk the comfort of my newfound peace, for the possibility of sharing it with someone who might need exactly what I had just learned to receive. When Pastor Williams asked the congregation to pray for visitors and newcomers, I felt God's prompting again, more insistent this time. She needs to know she is seen. She needs to know she is welcome. She needs to know she belongs. You know these things now, not because the congregation told you, but because I told you. Tell her. The divine assignment was clear, but the human execution felt terrifying, like being asked to perform surgery when you've only just learned to bandage your own wounds, like being asked to teach a language you've only recently learned to speak yourself. As the service progressed through familiar rhythms of hymns and scripture reading and offering time, I found myself watching her out of the corner of my eye, noting the careful way she participated, singing along quietly, following the liturgy in her bulletin, bowing her head during prayers, with the kind of reverent attention that suggested she was genuinely seeking divine encounter, not just going through religious motions or fulfilling social obligations. She was taking communion when it was offered, which meant she had some kind of faith background, but she was taking it alone, without the casual conversation and shared smiles that characterized most of the congregation's experience of the Lord's Supper. When the elements reached our back row, I watched her handle the bread and cup with the kind of careful reverence that suggested these weren't just symbols to her, but lifelines. Not just ritual observances, but desperate attempts to connect with a God she hoped was real and present and somehow aware of her particular brand of spiritual hunger. The moment of truth came during the closing hymn, when most of the congregation was already mentally transitioning from worship to fellowship time, when people were gathering their belongings and making plans for lunch and Sunday afternoon activities, when the service was officially ending, but the real test of community was about to begin. I watched her preparation to leave, the quick scanning of exits, the strategic timing that would allow her to slip out without getting caught in conversations she wasn't ready for, the protective posture that suggested she had learned to guard her heart against disappointment by leaving before anyone could make her feel unwelcome. And I recognized every movement because I had choreographed the same dance for 6 months, the careful ballet of participating without engaging, belonging without connecting, seeking without finding. Now came the divine whisper, and I knew that this was the moment, that if I was going to be obedient to the assignment God had given me, if I was going to risk my own comfort for her potential healing, if I was going to be the person I had needed someone to be for me, it had to be now, before she could execute her escape plan, before the opportunity passed, and I was left wondering what might have happened if I had been brave enough to follow divine prompting instead of human caution. As she stood to leave, fumbling with her purse and bulletin, and trying to time her exit to avoid the post-service social gauntlet, I stood too, my heart hammering against my ribs with the kind of holy fear that accompanies moments when God asks ordinary people to be part of His extraordinary plan to love the world one person at a time. "Excuse me," I said softly, and she turned with the wary expression of someone who had learned to be cautious about unexpected social interaction, someone who had been disappointed enough times to approach new relationships with protective skepticism. "I'm Sarah," I continued, extending my hand in what I hoped was a gesture of genuine warmth rather than obligatory church friendliness. "And I just wanted to say, I paused, searching for words that would carry divine love without sounding like religious rhetoric, that would communicate genuine care without seeming like pity or projection, that would offer exactly what she needed to hear without pretending to know more about her situation than a 30-second observation could reveal. I wanted to say that you belong here too. The words hung in the air between us like a bridge waiting to be crossed, simple but loaded with meaning that went far beyond their surface content, carrying the weight of divine commission and human vulnerability. The risk of misunderstanding and the possibility of connection. The echo of every word God had spoken over me during months of feeling invisible and forgotten, and somehow outside the circle of people who mattered. Her eyes filled with tears, so quickly. I knew I had hit something deep, some wound that had been waiting for exactly these words, some hunger that had been hoping for exactly this kind of recognition. And when she whispered, "Thank you," in a voice that shook with months or maybe years of accumulated loneliness, I knew that God had been orchestrating this encounter long before either of us had walked into the sanctuary that morning. "I've been visiting churches for months," she said, and the admission carried the weight of serial disappointment, of hope offered and withdrawn, of trying to find family in places that felt more like exclusive clubs than inclusive communities. "You're the first person to make me feel seen." The words hit me like divine confirmation that this encounter wasn't coincidental but providential, that my 6 months of back pew preparation had been leading to this moment when I could offer to someone else exactly what I had been learning to receive myself, when my experience of divine love could become a vehicle for extending that same love to another wounded soul seeking healing in sacred spaces. We talked for only a few minutes there in the emptying sanctuary, but in that brief conversation, I discovered that her name was Emma, that she was recently divorced and spiritually homeless, that she had been carrying the same questions I had carried about whether God's love was real or just religious theory, whether church people could be trusted with authentic vulnerability, whether belonging was something she could find or would always be something she watched other people experience from the margins. "Would you like to get coffee sometime?" I heard myself asking, the words emerging from some deep place of divine confidence that had nothing to do with my natural social skills and everything to do with the love that had been healing me, being ready to heal someone else through me. "I mean, I know we just met, but I've been where you are, and I'd love to share what I've been learning about finding God's love in places where human love feels scarce." She nodded enthusiastically, obviously hungry for exactly the kind of conversation I was offering, the kind of authentic sharing that goes deeper than church small talk and Sunday morning pleasantries, the kind of spiritual friendship that acknowledges real wounds and offers real healing, rather than superficial solutions and religious platitudes. We exchanged phone numbers right there in the sanctuary, with the post-service fellowship time swirling around us, but somehow not including us. And I realized that we were creating our own community, our own family, our own sacred space where being broken was acceptable and healing was possible, and love was available without performance or improvement or any requirement other than the willingness to receive what was being freely offered. As I drove home that Sunday, I found myself marveling at how completely my relationship with Cornerstone Baptist Church had been transformed, not because the congregation had suddenly become more welcoming, not because my circumstances had changed, not because I had finally figured out how to fit into their established social patterns, but because I had learned to receive my identity and worth and belonging from the source that never failed, never disappointed, never required me to be anyone other than exactly who I was. The back pew was no longer my place of exile. It was my mission field, the perfect vantage point for spotting other people who needed. Exactly what I had learned to give, exactly what God had been giving me all along. I was no longer the forgotten woman hoping to be remembered. I was the noticer, the seer, the one who had been trained by divine love to recognize divine love's need in others and respond accordingly. The following Tuesday, Emma and I met for coffee at the little shop where I had first received Zephaniah 3:17 on a receipt, and as we talked, I realized that my story was no longer just about learning to be loved by God. It was about learning to love others with God's love, about discovering that healing is never meant to end with the person being healed, but to flow through them to others who need exactly what they have learned to receive. Emma's questions were my questions from 6 months ago. Her wounds were my wounds in different packaging. Her hunger was my hunger expressed through different circumstances. And as I shared what I had learned about divine love that doesn't depend on human recognition, about belonging that comes from heaven rather than earth, about identity that is established by God rather than determined by people's responses, I could see hope beginning to dawn in her eyes the way it had dawned in mine during that midnight sanctuary encounter that changed everything. "You mean God actually delights in me right now?" she asked, and I heard my own voice from months of desperate questioning, my own disbelief that divine love could be that unconditional, that present, that personal. "You mean I don't have to earn belonging or prove my worth or fix myself before I'm qualified for acceptance?" And as I answered her questions with the same truths that had been healing my heart, I realized that my 6 months of back pew solitude hadn't been wasted time, but had been the exact preparation I needed to become the kind of person who could sit across from another wounded woman and offer hope that was tested, faith that was battle-scarred, love that was authentic, because it had been received in the midst of real pain rather than theoretical circumstances. I wasn't offering her religious platitudes or Sunday school answers. I was offering her the blood-bought, tear-earned, midnight-wrestled truth that God's love is real, present, personal, and completely unrelated to human performance or congregational approval. Over the following weeks, Emma and I began attending Sunday services together, still sitting in the back pews but no longer sitting alone, still somewhat disconnected from the main congregation, but no longer feeling excluded from the family that mattered most. We started an informal tradition of coffee after church, processing the sermon together, sharing our questions and doubts and discoveries, creating the kind of authentic spiritual community that we had both been seeking but hadn't known how to find or build. Other people began to notice us, 2 women who sat together in the back, who seemed to genuinely enjoy each other's company, who talked animatedly during fellowship time about something deeper than weather and work and weekend plans. And slowly, gradually, we found ourselves in conversations with other congregation members who were drawn to the kind of authentic faith we were modeling, the kind of real relationship that wasn't dependent on having all the answers or presenting perfect spiritual lives. Mrs. Patterson, the church secretary who had been greeting me with scripted warmth for months, mentioned one Sunday that she envied the obvious friendship Emma and I shared, that she'd been attending church for 15 years, but had never found the kind of spiritual intimacy she observed between us. Mr. Carlson, whose whispered prayers I had been overhearing for months, asked if we would be willing to pray with him about his marriage struggles, saying that we seemed to have the kind of faith that had been tested and proven rather than simply inherited and assumed. The youth pastor's wife, who had always seemed too busy for real conversation, admitted that she was struggling with feeling isolated despite being surrounded by church people, and wondered if we would consider starting some kind of small group for women who wanted to go deeper than surface-level spirituality. What had begun as my personal healing journey had become a ministry of multiplication, divine love received in solitude, flowing out to create authentic community. Back pew isolation transformed into launching pad for the kind of church culture that actually reflected the heart of the God who sees the invisible, includes the excluded, and sings over the forgotten. Emma and I found ourselves at the center of something we had never planned, but somehow always needed. A network of people who were learning to be loved by God in ways that didn't depend on human approval, who were discovering identity and worth and belonging. In relationship with the one who delighted in them exactly as they were, who were being transformed from performers seeking applause to beloved children resting in acceptance that could never be earned and could never be lost. 6 months after Emma first walked into that sanctuary carrying the same spiritual hunger I had carried, Cornerstone Baptist Church began to feel like a different place, not because the building had changed or the pastoral staff had been replaced or the denominational theology had shifted, but because a small group of formerly invisible people had learned to see each other with divine eyes, to love each other with divine love, to create the kind of community that reflected heaven's values rather than earth's social hierarchies. The back pews were no longer the place where forgotten people went to hide. They had become the place where healers were trained, where wounded people learned to become wounded healers, where divine love was received and then redistributed to others who needed exactly what we had learned to give. I look back now on that first Sunday when I sat alone in the back pew counting floral patterns and wondering if God had forgotten my address. And I understand that he hadn't forgotten me at all. He had been preparing me, preparing the perfect circumstances for me to learn the kind of love that could only be learned in solitude, to receive the kind of healing that could only happen in divine presence undiluted by human agenda, to develop the kind of spiritual vision that could only come from being stripped of everything I thought I needed, so that I could discover everything I actually had. The isolation that felt like punishment was actually preparation. The rejection that felt like abandonment was actually protection. The invisibility that felt like evidence of my insignificance was actually proof of how significant I was to the God who was willing to meet me in the margins, to love me in the silence, to sing over me in frequencies that only my heart could hear. My story didn't end with learning to be loved by God. It began there, with that foundation of divine acceptance, providing the security I needed to love others without expecting anything in return, to see others without needing to be seen by them, to give others what I had received without keeping score or demanding reciprocity. The back pew became my seminary, the empty sanctuary became my classroom, the midnight wrestling became my graduation ceremony, and the divine love that healed my heart became the curriculum I would spend the rest of my life teaching to other people who needed to know that they are seen, known, loved, and sung over by the God who specializes in transforming forgotten daughters into beloved healers, invisible women into agents of divine love, back pew dwellers into frontline ministers of the kind of acceptance that changes everything. Because here's what I learned during those 6 months of thinking I was invisible. God never stops seeing us, never stops singing over us, never stops delighting in us, even when, especially when, we can't see or hear or feel him doing it. The song continues whether we recognize the melody or not. The love continues whether we feel worthy of it or not. The belonging continues whether human communities include us or not. Because our identity and worth and place in the universe are established by divine decree rather than human consensus, grounded in eternal truth rather than temporal circumstances, secured by unconditional love rather than conditional acceptance. And sometimes, when we finally learn to hear the song that has been playing over us all along, we discover that we're not just the audience. We're also the choir, called to sing that same song over others who are sitting in their own back pews, counting their own floral patterns, wondering if anyone sees them, anyone loves them, anyone would miss them if they disappeared. We become the voice that whispers, "You belong here too." The hands that offer divine love through human touch, the hearts that recognize divine hunger in human eyes, the living proof that God's love is not just theological theory, but practical reality, not just future hope, but present experience, not just something we believe, but something we become and then offer to a world that is desperately hungry for the kind of acceptance that never fails, never disappoints, never requires us to be anyone other than exactly who we are. 1 year later, on a crisp November morning that reminded me of the day I first walked into Cornerstone Baptist Church, carrying hope wrapped in protective skepticism, I arrived at the sanctuary to find not one, but 3 women sitting alone in the back pews, each carrying the familiar posture of someone seeking belonging while protecting against disappointment, each scanning the room with eyes that were hungry and guarded in equal measure. Emma, who now sat beside me every Sunday and had become not just my closest friend but my partner in the ministry of noticing invisible people, nudged me gently and nodded toward our newest assignments, our latest opportunities to love others with the same extravagant, unconditional love that had transformed us from seekers into finders, from forgotten into rememberers, from wounded into healers. "Should we?" she whispered, and I smiled as I remembered the divine prompting that had changed everything exactly 1 year ago, the holy fear that had accompanied my first attempt to be the person I needed someone to be for me, the terrifying and wonderful moment when I learned that being loved by God inevitably leads to loving others with God's love, that receiving divine acceptance naturally flows into offering that same acceptance to others who need exactly what we've learned to receive. Absolutely, I whispered back, and together we rose from our seats and walked toward three women who had no idea they were about to hear the four words that would change everything. You belong here too. The back pews at Cornerstone Baptist Church are no longer the place where invisible people go to hide. They're the place where healing happens, where divine love is received and redistributed, where formerly forgotten women have learned to become professional noticers, where the song that God sings over his beloved daughters is finally being heard and sung and passed along to others who need to know that they are seen, known, loved, and celebrated by the one whose opinion is the only one that ultimately matters. And every Sunday morning, as I watch new women discover what I discovered in this sacred space, I'm reminded that God never wastes our wounds, never discards our pain, never overlooks our stories. He redeems them, transforms them, uses them to heal others who need exactly what we've learned to give, proving once again that what the enemy meant for harm, God uses for good, that what felt like abandonment was actually apprenticeship, that what looked like the end of our story was actually just the beginning of the chapter where broken people learn to become wounded healers, where forgotten daughters learn to become divine rememberers, where women who once sat alone counting floral patterns learn to become the voice that whispers hope into the silence of other people's loneliness. Because that's what love does. It multiplies, spreads, transforms isolation into community, wounds into wisdom, pain into purpose, and back-pew solitude into frontline ministry for the God who sees everyone, loves everyone, sings over everyone, and uses ordinary people like us to make sure that no one who walks into his house will ever have to sit alone again, wondering if they matter, wondering if they belong, wondering if anyone would notice if they simply disappeared. We are his choir now, singing his song of acceptance over others, proving that divine love is not just theoretical theology, but practical reality, not just something we believe, but something we become and then offer to a world that is desperately hungry for the kind of belonging that comes from heaven rather than earth, the kind of acceptance that never fails, never disappoints, never requires performance, and never ends. The song continues. The love multiplies, and the back pews at Cornerstone Baptist Church have become the launching pad for a revolution of divine love that started with one forgotten woman learning to hear the music that had been playing over her all along, and now extends to everyone who needs to know that they are not invisible, not forgotten, not alone, but seen and known and loved and sung over by the God who delights in his children and uses their healing to heal others, their stories to rewrite other stories, their transformed lives to transform the world one Sunday morning, one back pew, one whispered, "You belong here too," at a time.